Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing the second half of Chapter 7, adapted from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. And this particular section concerns the first major armed conflict that we encounter as a nation in the 19th century, and that is the War of 1812. Now, if you stop the average person on the street and you bring up the War of 1812, you ask them why it was fought, who was involved, any information about it, chances are you're going to get a lot of confused and blank stares. Okay, and that's because the War of 1812 is one that really doesn't have any very clearly defined expectations or outcomes. Okay, this is a war that seems, in hindsight, to have been largely unnecessary. Okay. And of course, there are certain instances where people can look at details regarding this and say, well, maybe it's justified because of this, that, or the other. But by and large, this seems to have been a largely mismanaged conflict, as we'll see. Okay, and many people even consider this to be kind of a sequel war to the American Revolution, right? To try to tie up loose ends or to somehow resolve things that were otherwise left unresolved by the Revolution. Okay, so we'll go into some of the details here, and I'll try to explain it as best I can. So, going back to the Napoleonic period, okay, this is kind of piggybacking on what we talked about in the last presentation about the early republic and the U.S. and the world's relationship to the Empire of France under Napoleon. Okay. In 1803, Napoleon decides he's going to declare war on Great Britain. Okay, and Napoleon by this point has gathered a massive amount of territory in Central Europe. Okay, and as I've said a couple of times already in previous presentations, the amount of territory that he gains rivals that of Nazi Germany in the 1940s. Okay, it's similar territory and similar in scope as well. Okay, and here's a map just to give you an idea. Okay, all of the green on the map here, including the lighter kind of olive green, pale green colors. This is all the Empire of France, right? This is what Napoleon has either taken over or countries that are at least allied with him. Okay, so all of the kind of yellowish colored countries here are countries who are allied against him. Okay, and the kind of pinkish areas off into the south, the Ottoman Empire and so forth, are largely neutral in this case, right? So again, this is a massive amount of territory that he's managed to conquer in a very short period of time. Now, in 1805, France, again, has controlled most of mainland Europe here, and the British Navy at this point still controls the sea, okay, because now the British Navy is finally beginning to come into its own as the most powerful navy in the world. Okay, before Great Britain had this title, right, Spain and the Spanish Armada had it. Okay, but after the Spanish Armada was destroyed, when Queen Elizabeth was still in, the monarch, everything ends up shifting over to Great Britain. The very next year in 1806, Britain decides it's going to try to impose a naval blockade on mainland Europe to try to prevent other countries from getting into trade with the French. Okay, and they refer to this as the Orders of Council. Okay, and it seems like the Navy is really Britain's only option at this point in terms of being able to stave off an attack from Napoleon. Okay, the French have a navy, but it's not quite up to snuff in terms of the size of the ships, the armaments themselves, the sheer number of sailors and so forth involved. And the British are beginning to seize American ships and impress sailors into service. And this is a leftover feature from the American Revolution. Okay, the British began doing this almost as soon as America became a nation. It's kind of a passive-aggressive way of trying to reassert dominance over the newly formed United States. And in some cases, the British even go so far as to try to justify this by saying that the sailors they're taking are actually British-born individuals, okay, who may have migrated to the United States during or immediately after the Revolution. Okay, so there's a strange loophole here that Britain is trying to exercise. And of course, the U.S. responds in kind here by completely banning all British imports. Okay, saying that if you're going to continue to do this to us, if you're going to try to take our sailors and so forth, we are going to not do business with you. Year after that, in 1807, Napoleon decides he's going to do the exact same thing to Great Britain that Great Britain did to him. Right? He's going to try to blockade Great Britain by stationing ships all around the islands and to basically cut off trade between Great Britain and the French Caribbean. Okay, and at this point, the Caribbean is becoming a little bit more of a hot spot for a lot of trade. Right? We have sugarcane plantations down there. There are a few tobacco plantations. So there's a lot of high-end commodities that are coming out of the Caribbean here. Rum, of course, molasses, and so forth. And so now these U.S. ships that are being stopped and searched, right, are really caught between two different countries here looking for allegiance. Okay, remember France and the United States have kind of cut ties a bit after we refused to come to the full-fledged aid during the French Revolution, and of course after the American Revolution, Great Britain is already kind of in a sour position with us anyway. Okay, so there's really no good answer here. Okay, there's no good way that we can come down on a side of a clear winner. And the other thing about this too is American ships are also beginning to attract a lot of deserters from the British Navy because they're being paid nearly twice as much as they would be if they were sailing on a British vessel. Okay, because the United States is making a lot of money right now. And it's estimated that between the years 1803 and 1811, right on the verge of the War of 1812, 6,200 Americans are actually taken into service, right? They're basically kidnapped, okay? Their ships are stopped, all of the sailors are taken off board, are put into shackles, and are then put into service in the Royal Navy, and they don't have any way of getting out of it, okay? If they try to get out of it, then they're considered deserters and they can be shot. Okay, so this is a very precarious situation to be put into if you're a sailor. Now, the first quote-unquote shots fired here with regard to the American Revolution, or at least the events that presuppose it here, happened in 1807 because we have the HMS Leopard. This is a British vessel that opens fire on the USS Chesapeake. Okay, because the Chesapeake says, we're not going to give in to your demands to be searched. Okay, the British try to search the U.S. vessel, and the U.S. say, no, we're not having it. 3 men get killed, and 4 are actually taken prisoners here. So this is actually, again, a situation where blood has been drawn. And even though Thomas Jefferson, who is still president at this point, is completely outraged by what has happened here, by the fact that the British have opened fire on an American vessel, he refuses to declare war. Okay, so this is a situation where he, again, has essentially shot himself in the foot. If you recall from the first half of this presentation, we talked about the fact that Jefferson slashed a lot of budgets because he didn't agree with what Alexander Hamilton had done. Okay, and part of the budget that he slashed was the armed forces budget. Okay, so now he's in a position where he could and very likely should have to go to war with Great Britain, but because he has already cut the army in half himself, he now has no way of responding. So the Embargo Act of 1807 is his alternative here. Okay, this is his way of exacting what he refers to as peaceable coercion. Okay, and what he does here is something that is kind of like dropping a nuclear bomb on the American economy, right? All of the advancements that Hamilton managed to make after the war, what little progress we've made, suddenly all gets flushed down the tubes. Okay, because what this does is it cuts all American foreign trade off entirely. Okay, so now the U.S. is not doing business with anybody. Okay. And of course, this completely destroys the U.S. economy almost immediately, okay, because, again, in places like New England, which rely almost exclusively on foreign trade as part of their economies, suddenly the Federalists are saying, hey, look at what this stupid Republican president is doing. Why don't you come back over here? We'll try to smooth things over, and the Federalists will regain office and leave it to better men all over again. Okay, so again, this seems like it's going to put a lot of egg on Thomas Jefferson's face. And of course, this ends up having a major impact, again, in New England especially. A lot of towns suddenly are deserted. There's no shipping coming or going anywhere, and there's virtually no reason to stay. U.S. export values plummet dramatically here, from $48 million in 1 year down to only $9 million. Okay, so this is a huge, huge amount of money that suddenly disappears completely from the American economy. And Jefferson is actually forced to try to activate local militias here to prevent smuggling from occurring, mainly because, again, the armed forces have been completely cut. Okay, they've been cut almost in half. And so he's having to, have local militias take up the slack here. And again, smuggling is occurring because people are their entire livelihood revolves around shipping in many cases. In 1809, this is something that's so unpopular that Congress decides immediately upon the day that Thomas Jefferson leaves office that Congress is going to do away with this embargo. Okay, they're saying, look, as long as Jefferson's in office, we're going to have to deal with this, but as soon as he's gone, this ends. Okay, because we need our economy to bounce back. Now, a quick side note here about the two-term limit for presidents. Thomas Jefferson is actually the first one to continue the tradition of a president only serving 2 terms in office. Okay, George Washington, again, as the first president, had the ability to serve technically as many terms as he wanted. There were no actual limits at that point. John Adams, of course, was so unpopular that he only served 1 term in office, but the actual establishment of this doesn't come around until 1951. Okay, so this is really just something of more of a tradition at this point. Okay, this is a common question that a lot of people end up having. Getting back to the narrative here, as soon as Jefferson ends up leaving office, James Madison ends up winning the presidency. And remember, Madison has got a long history fully embedded in the United States, okay, from its foundation all the way through to policy making and serving as vice president under Thomas Jefferson, okay. And of course, we have a recurring situation here where Federalist candidates, Charles Pinckney and Rufus King, attempt to run for the presidency yet again, president and vice president here, that is. And of course, they lose the election again, okay. This ends up happening at least one more time. Madison, in comparison to his predecessors, is actually characterized as a pretty weak-willed individual, okay, and he's not a very decisive president either. So for him to really inherit a lot of the troubles that Jefferson leaves behind really puts him at a major disadvantage, okay, and the fact that he, as a personality type, is very introverted, okay, he doesn't seem to really have the the wherewithal to stand up in public and give a lot of major speeches. He is a very good theorist and so forth, but he's not exactly a very good statesman in that regard. Not as much as Thomas Jefferson was. His wife, Dolly Madison, though, is considered to be the first, quote-unquote, first lady that we have in office who takes a really active role in her position. Okay, she's actually given the moniker the Queen of Washington because she's the one who actually begins to hold these major parties for foreign dignitaries, begins to really play more of the statesman even than her husband does here. And Madison really doesn't quite know what to do with what he's been given after Jefferson leaves office, okay? And his only real recourse here is to continue this idea of peaceable coercion, okay? And again, it's done in a slightly different form because Congress has already done away with the Embargo Act of 1807, okay? So we're opening America back up to shipping and commerce again, but now Madison has to figure out another way around it, okay? And what Congress decides to do is it puts limitations here on who the U.S. is actually going to end up trading with. Okay, so it opens up trade to every other country in the world except for France and Great Britain because they're involved in this conflict now. Okay. And France vaguely promises that it's going to end up complying with this. Okay, it says, all right, fine, whatever. But Great Britain doesn't actually come out and say we are going to cooperate or not. Okay, and Madison looks at this and he ends up interpreting this as an act of war. Okay, as something where they are actually not going to comply, and right, he's essentially giving them an ultimatum without actually saying it's an ultimatum. Okay, so this is the first time Madison goes to Congress and he asks them to declare war in 1812. Okay, so this is what immediately leads us into the war itself. And again, justifiable or not, I leave that up to you as the listener here. As far as the individuals who support or are against a war, the Republicans are the ones who end up supporting it more than anyone else, right? And the Republicans at this point make up most of the population of the South and the western portion of the United States, okay? And it's not really so surprisingly that they support war, right? Because again, they seem to have kind of this sense of personal honor at stake. They're a little bit prickly about that. And then the Federalists in New England are completely opposed to this, right? They want trade to resume with everybody so that the economy can bounce back, right? The entire economy of New England has gone in the tank because of this embargo, okay? So a war seems like it would only prolong the issue. And of course, the declaration of war also gives Republicans this opportunity to potentially unite the country into a common cause of some kind. Because remember, under Jefferson, this whole situation with, with embargoes and so forth, the economy going downhill, seems like a way to further divide the country. So, it's kind of a Hail Mary, so to speak, here to try to get the country reunited by war. But here it is. Okay, and the other potential here is that if we extend this war into British Canada, we could potentially stop Native American attacks, which have been continuing since the end of the American Revolution. Okay, that's something that has not actually stopped. Okay, so again, we're trying to do a lot with this one particular declaration of war, and it seems like people are essentially scrambling for excuses as to why this could be justified. So again, the War of 1812 is actually the first time that Congress declares war. And remember, this is a responsibility of Congress to be able to do this, okay? Anytime the U.S. actually enters into an official war of some kind, right, something where the term war is actually used in the title, right, it involves the president going to Congress and requesting a declaration of war. Okay, the only major instance that ends up skirting this issue occurs in the 1950s when Harry Truman decides not to go to Congress when it comes to Korea. Okay, he goes straight to the United Nations, and so that's why the Korean War is actually called a Korean police action at the time. Okay, kind of subverts the idea that the president has really kind of exercised a loophole. Okay, so anyway, back to this. This is the first time that Congress declares war, and immediately Great Britain realizes that it should have been clearer in its response, okay, because it's been so occupied with this war with France this whole time. Getting the United States involved all of a sudden seems like a really bad idea, because Great Britain has already lost one war with the U.S. Okay? It realizes that the U.S. is at a disadvantage, but the combination of France and Great Britain, or France and the United States, that is, could be a big problem for Great Britain. Okay, so immediately they start to say, okay, wait a minute, we should have been clearer in what we said to you, and all this kind of stuff. But at this point, it seems for the United States there is no going back. The U.S. is really, really concerned about this idea of impressment, okay, where sailors are concerned, okay. It's something that is actually harming the economy, and again, it's people being kidnapped directly off of a ship and being put into the service of another country. Okay, it seems almost like something of a terrorist attack, if you want to think of it in those terms. And again, native attacks as well are something that Great Britain has constantly been prodding and imposing on the United States throughout this entire period. Again, most of the pro-war votes do come from the South and the West, okay, because these farmers are the ones that are hurt by the shipping raids the most, okay. Farmers are the ones in the South and the West who are actually producing most of the agricultural exports that are being sent to Europe in some regard, okay. So when these ships are actually being attacked and all of the goods are being seized, right, these farmers are essentially their money's being stolen. Okay? So for a war to actually occur and for this to end seems like it could spell a potential solution for the farmers. And again, the motivations behind this war and joining in with it are the most puzzling of all. Okay, again, Jefferson has already put the military at a disadvantage by downsizing it, by cutting its budget. Okay, this makes us completely unprepared for another war. The economy has completely tanked because we now have no money, right? We have shipping embargoes that have been put in place. No one is doing business with us, so the money has dried up. And again, people are constantly at this point in time crowing over the two major issues of free trade and sailors' rights. Okay, they seem to be the only real rallying cries that exist at this point. Okay, and they seem vague at best because they don't affect everyone all over the country equally. Okay, and again, there's this need at this point in time to put aside sectionalist differences and come to a united national consensus. Okay, so it's difficult to do at this point. And so this is when the question of national honor comes into play, right? Are we going to allow Great Britain and France to act with impunity against us? Okay? Are we going to allow them to continue to treat us like a little brother, or at worst, a bully or a rival or something along those lines? Okay? Are we going to allow this to continue unhindered? And Andrew Jackson, who at this point in time is actually a soldier, ends up saying, this is the reestablishment of our national character, quote unquote, is at stake. Okay, saying that we've already proven to Great Britain that we're capable of defeating them, and now all of a sudden we're being bullied again. Okay, so it seems like we need to reassert our dominance here somehow. And again, once we ended the American Revolution to begin with, we were already at a disadvantage. Okay, so for the United States to bounce back from that and then try to take another step forward seems like a pretty steep task. Again, unsurprisingly, New Englanders vote completely against this war. They want shipping and commerce to resume because their entire economy is gone. And in many cases, they even say, quote unquote, let the Southern heroes fight their own battles, right? If you want to get into a war, right, go ahead and you all get into a war, but allow us to continue to do business as usual because your concerns are not our concerns. So again, just beginning in the 19th century, we already see the sectional differences between the North and the South. And this war in particular is one that could arguably begin this pattern of creating a larger rift over time between the two until we eventually get to the Civil War. And again, the Civil War, many people immediately after the war try to pitch it as something that is fought over states' rights versus the federal government. But again, slavery is still the key underpinning in all this. So for this particular instance, though, it starts to amplify this rift between the North and the South. Now again, there are still several major Native American conflicts occurring in the United States. Okay, up and down the Ohio River Valley especially, the British are constantly prodding the Native Americans to attack American settlers because they are still trying to stoke the flames of resentment here. Okay, because the Native Americans know that the British made them a lot of promises about how this was going to end when it came to the American Revolution. Okay, the British said we're going to give you land back and all this kind of stuff. And most Native American tribes have been essentially given the shaft here, right? They're not really given any positive outcome to this war, okay? No matter which side they chose. Okay, so in the War of 1812, right, there's still plenty of sour grapes, okay, and the Native Americans have already been fed a lot of empty promises, okay, so their only outlet here is to continue to attack American settlers and hope that at some point they're going to give up. The individual Tecumseh here, whose name means shooting star, becomes really popular. He is a Shawnee leader who does what a lot of other Native American leaders tried to do before him. Okay, and even thereafter as well, and that he tries to unite several different local tribes in the vicinity as kind of a common fighting force against American expansion. Okay, and in this case, he does it with the help of the British. Okay, so his group is known as the Indian Confederacy. Another individual who you don't really hear about all that often is the half-brother to Tecumseh, a man named Tenskwatawa. His name means open door. And Tenskwatawa is a very unique individual in all this, right? Tecumseh is kind of romanticized as this heroic, freedom fighter individual, but Tenskwatawa is kind of he's known as being a recovering alcoholic. He has only one eye, and he's also considered to be a prophet of some kind. He's almost got this medicine man persona, so he's very charismatic in the way that he's able to rally people. And Tenskwatawa's message to the Indian Confederacy here that his half-brother is in charge of is to give up everything European, okay, and he actually is one of the first ones to refer to white Americans as, quote, the children of the devil. Okay, we get this phrase of white devil being used by Native American tribes, being used eventually, of course, by the descendants of African slaves and even African slaves themselves, right? So this is kind of beginning to popularize this phrase and this ideology. In 1811, Tecumseh starts to speak in front of a lot of tribal gatherings. He immediately denounces the sale of native lands, and he actually becomes more and more radicalized over time and says that natives need to start killing all whites that they can find. Okay, so this is not really open for debate. We're not open for any kind of peaceable solution here. Okay, he's calling for all-out war and massacre as much as possible. The governor of the Indiana Territory, which is, of course, just right north of the Ohio River here, is William Henry Harrison, okay, who also becomes president, albeit for a very brief time. We'll talk about him in a later chapter. William Henry Harrison sets his sights on Tecumseh and vows that he is going to destroy him. Okay, he says, we're not going to allow these kinds of incursions to continue, regardless of whatever promises we've made or broken or both to Native Americans, right? We don't need these types of attacks to continue. And so he ends up attacking Prophetstown, which is kind of the headquarters of Tecumseh, Tenskwatawa, and the Indian Confederacy here. Attacks Prophetstown with 1,000 troops, but he misses Tecumseh. Okay, Tecumseh is actually away when he does this. Tenskwatawa is lured into an attack on Harrison's encampment and is actually captured. And the Battle of Tippecanoe is what William Henry Harrison is most well known for. Harrison's men actually come in and burn Prophetstown to the ground and defeat the native forces, okay, kind of doing away with the Indian Confederacy thereafter. Okay, Tecumseh does survive this, though, and actually goes on to get killed in the War of 1812 a little bit further on down the road. But Tenskwatawa, I believe, actually lives, he lives until 1836, so he actually, I believe, dies in captivity. But the Battle of Tippecanoe becomes kind of a rallying cry for when Harrison becomes president later on. Now, again, the incentives for getting involved in this war, in addition to just the excuses and the reasonings, are not always something that the United States can really back up that well. Okay, the primary goal here, in addition to fighting off the British, trying to keep the natives out of their hair, is to potentially seize British-controlled Canada. Okay, because Canada is it's a massive territory, just like the Louisiana Territory was. It's something that could potentially be developed, could extend into thriving markets with the fur trade and so forth. And in terms of the sheer number of people living in each territory, right, there's 8 million Americans at this point and only about 300,000 Canadians. Okay, so it seems like Americans could potentially invade, take over the country very swiftly. To kind of complicate matters, the Spanish end up retaining control of East Florida in 1783. Okay, so on our southern border now, we end up having the Spanish kind of encroaching a little bit as well. And Spain at this point has already weakened considerably from its initial outpouring into the Western Hemisphere, right? It's overextended itself when it comes to trying to find gold in the New World, right? It's had failed attempts to colonize to a certain extent, and it's overextended itself through a lot of the religious wars that have occurred. Okay, so Spain is already pretty considerably on the decline. And its power in the Western Hemisphere is actually broken by the end of the 19th century. Okay, so it's already very sharply on the decline right now. And Spain really can't fend off any of the native attacks on the Georgia border at this point. Right? We have a lot of native tribes that are involved in guerrilla warfare. Creek Indians, the Cherokee, the Seminole, right? They're all having these major incursions into Spanish-controlled territory, and the Spanish are like, look, we're at our wits' end here. We're almost just ready to give up this territory. And it's also a pretty wild country at this point, right? This is getting into the Everglades, okay? This is a region where escaped slaves are able to get out into the wilderness and get away. They might not ever show up again, right? They might be eaten by alligators or drown in a swamp or any other potential problems here. And British smugglers also like to have little hideouts in the region as well. So this is a territory that's fraught with difficulties and something that really cannot be effectively controlled. The name given to the individuals who are vocal proponents of the war is the term war hawks. Okay, and this is actually something that is used even into the 20th century when it comes to individuals eager to go to war on behalf of the U.S. Okay, this is used a lot during the Vietnam War. Right, we have war hawks and doves. Okay, people who are peacemongers, so to speak. And among the war hawks at this particular time are Henry Clay, who is a Kentucky planter and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Okay, he specifically is the one who sets his sights on Canada as something to integrate into the U.S. territory. And we also have John C. Calhoun, who is a political theorist from South Carolina, and he and Henry Clay cannot stand one another. Okay, they become actually pretty bitter rivals for the remainder of their lives, and the two of them actually continue to spar vocally on the floor of the House of Representatives all the way up until the eve of the Civil War, okay, when both men are actually suffering from illnesses and dying, quite literally. So the two of them, no love lost here, but this is when they really start to make a name for themselves. And again, can't be stressed enough that the New Englanders are completely opposed to the war. They don't like this at all. Okay? It's going to damage their shipping industry. And England, at this point, too, it's worth noting, is the largest trade partner for New England. Okay, so the two of them have had a symbiotic relationship up until this point, despite all the wars and stuff that have gone on. And it gets to the point where New England actually, in some cases, completely refuses to send any soldiers at all. Okay, so Massachusetts and Connecticut in particular say, we're not going to get involved in this in any regard. And there are some U.S. merchants that are still selling supplies to British troops that are stationed in Canada. Okay, so trying to kind of skirt the issue here by not technically selling anything overseas, they're just going across the border and doing it over land. Now, again, it's already pretty clear at this point that the U.S. is not prepared for another major war. Okay, the U.S. military is already at a statistical disadvantage when it comes to the sheer number of people involved. The British have about 250,000 soldiers, okay, and arguably the strongest navy in the world. Okay, over 600 warships involved. Okay. Not to mention the other thousands of soldiers that are stationed not only in Canada, but also in the West Indies. Okay, so in the Caribbean, kind of scattered all over the place in the Southern Atlantic here. Okay, and they also end up recruiting more Native allies than the Americans do. Again, just like they did in the American Revolution. Okay, making a lot of empty promises that they're going to grant native lands back to the natives if and when the British win the war. And in terms of the American soldiers, we have just a little under 3,300 poorly trained and poorly equipped soldiers. Okay, and the officers themselves are very inexperienced. Okay, so you might have one or two individuals who have never actually seen combat, who are officers, who have been career officers. By the time we get to 1813, the numbers end up inflating to about 18,500, and most of the recruits here are actually Irish immigrants who come to the United States and who cannot stand the British. Okay? And they're given promises of land, of cash bonuses to fight against the British. And at this point, there's no love lost between the British and the Irish anyway. Okay, so it's more incentive for the Irish to kind of fight against their ancient enemy here. And the governors in New England, again, continue to refuse to send militiamen to fight. Okay, they're wanting to retain their own local militias in case this isolationism can't be contained. Right? If they're not able to fend off attacks, they need someone there to protect them. All free blacks and slaves are not allowed to fight at all at this point. Okay, and this was a rule that was bent toward the end of the American Revolution. Okay, even the Patriot forces did begin to allow freed African Americans to fight in the war, but in this particular stage, we kind of go back a step there. The U.S. does have a navy to speak of here, but there's only 16 gunboats, okay, which is pretty pitiful compared, again, to the British Royal Navy with 600. And again, the national economy is already in a weakened state, so there's really no easy way to to build up funding for war. Okay. In 1811, the charter of the Bank of the United States also expires, which makes things even worse. Okay, now we don't have any more banking regulation. Okay, so in other words, banks now don't actually have national currency to issue anymore. No one is watching them, and so in some cases, you go back to the old American Revolution way, where you have local banks that are actually issuing state-specific money. Okay, so again, Connecticut money, no good in Pennsylvania, that kind of thing. Again, there's very inadequate funding for a war at this point, okay? The government can try to levy taxes here, but again, you could have another situation where the people of the United States rebel against their own government, okay? And also the British are blockading American ports once again, okay? So all federal tariff revenues end up going in the tank, okay? There's no way that we can gain money from taxing foreign imports because there are no foreign imports. And congressional Republicans also say that they're going to delay any kind of tax increases just because they're concerned that people are going to begin revolting, and rightly so. Now, again, Canada becomes a major focal point early on in the war here, and it's something that seems like kind of rather than defending the shores of the United States, it's kind of an offensive attack here, and seems like an opportunistic thing, but it ends up going afoul very, very quickly. Okay, so the U.S. Decides it's going to invade Canada to divide British forces on 3 different fronts. Okay, the first wave is going to go through Upper New York and take Montreal. Okay. Unfortunately, this is already shot down because there's a lack of funding, right? There's no way that they can fund the sheer number of soldiers and weapons and so forth to actually pull this off, okay? So unfortunately, that aspect is completely thrown out almost immediately. The second one goes up the Niagara River between Ontario and Lake Erie, okay? Again, this seems like this could be a potential opportunity, right? Because it's an overland direction to go. But again, this ends with the American forces being defeated. Again, primarily because they're inexperienced, okay? The British actually have a standing army of career soldiers at all times, and the soldiers in the United States Army, again, have been ill-equipped, ill-prepared, ill-trained, and their officers are usually pretty incompetent. And the third one is to go through Detroit in the west, okay, into the Michigan territory, okay, across the Thames River. William Hull, who is one of the American commanders here, immediately surrenders an entire 2,500 troop army to British forces. Okay? He doesn't even try to put up a fight here. And he is dismissed for cowardice immediately thereafter. Okay, so this gives you a sense of just what is going through the minds of these American officers. Zebulon Pike is another individual. He actually leads a force against York, which is modern-day Toronto. Okay, Pike is actually killed in the process, and York is ultimately destroyed by the Americans. So this seems like it's kind of a bittersweet victory a bit here. And Oliver Hazard Perry ends up leading American ships against the British in the Great Lakes. Okay, and at this point there are actually more British ships in the Great Lakes than there are ships in the American Navy. Okay, so we're talking about a couple of dozen ships at least existing in the Great Lakes that belong to the British. And Oliver Hazard Perry actually does end up accepting the British surrender, even though he loses several crew members, he loses a lot of guns in the process. And the British finally end up evacuating Upper Canada and are finally defeated at the Battle of the Thames, which you see kind of almost here in the center of the map between the Michigan Territory and Brock. Okay, and this is the battle where Tecumseh is finally killed. Okay? So this ends up fulfilling what William Henry Harrison wanted to do all along. The Americans do manage to recover most of Michigan and western Upper Canada here, but after that they're really locked into a stalemate. They don't really recover any more territory, nor do they lose any. Okay, so this becomes a situation where invading Canada is almost a self-defeating principle. Okay, it doesn't really go anywhere. Now, the Creek War is something that ends up happening in the southern part of the United States, right, along the kind of the Georgia and Florida borders here, and even into modern-day Alabama. What we see in 1813 is the Creek Indians end up splitting into two different factions. Okay, we have the Upper Creeks that call themselves the Red Sticks, okay, and they call themselves the Red Sticks because of these red dyed weapons that you see up here on the top right. Okay, these are kind of war clubs with maybe like a stone spike or something on one end. And the Red Sticks are the ones that are opposed to American expansion. They're the ones that have sided with the British in the midst of all this. And the others are the lower Creeks. Okay, these side with the Americans and want to maintain good relations with the Americans as much as possible. Okay, so it's almost a Creek civil war, if you like. So on August 30th of 1813, the Red Sticks attack Fort Mims. Okay, and Fort Mims is located right down here, right just above where it says Mexican Gulf. Okay, this is just right across from Mobile, Alabama. Okay, and this is where Andrew Jackson makes a name for himself in this particular conflict, is that he recruits 2,500 volunteer militiamen and ends up putting down the Red Sticks here. Okay, and among his numbers, we also get David Crockett, who is also very famous for his involvement in the Alamo eventually. At this point, Davy Crockett is only 27 years old. He's already made a name for himself as a frontiersman and a sharpshooter from North Carolina. And we also get 19-year-old Sam Houston, okay, who is, again, the first president of the Republic of Texas, which we'll talk about in a future chapter as well. And he is considered a frontiersman as well. So these two men already are getting involved in politics, or getting involved in conflict at large here. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend, again, is something that ends up catapulting Andrew Jackson to fame, because Jackson and his forces end up burning a Red Stick fort. Okay, and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, again, occurs kind of where this second little explosion mark is here on the map. It's up the Alabama River from Fort Mims. In this particular battle, 900 Red Sticks are killed, okay, and about 300 of them are actually drowned in the Alabama River. Fewer than 50 of Jackson's men, though, were killed. Okay, so this is a very rousing success for Jackson and his crew, and it's notably present that Jackson and his group are very brutal in the way that they kill these people. They set fire to the Red Stick fort and begin to kill everybody that escapes. Okay, so the Red Sticks have one of two options. They can burn to death, or they can run outside and be either shot or drowned by Jackson's forces. So it's a pretty brutal takedown of the Red Sticks. The Treaty of Fort Jackson, which is what this ultimately becomes known as here, sees the Red Sticks completely surrender 2/3 of their land. So almost the entire territory of what eventually becomes Alabama, part of Georgia, and that whole region ends up essentially going away. And this ends up crippling the Creek Indians thereafter. Okay, they have no ability to wage war at all. Meanwhile, the British managed to repel Napoleon in both Spain and Portugal, and now the British are able to focus all of their efforts on America and continuing to fight this war. Okay, if they weren't able to do this from the get-go, it seems like the war might have turned out vastly different. But again, it's difficult to tell. British soldiers, though, are sent to Canada, and they end up blockading the entire Atlantic coast all the way down to Florida. Okay, so it seems like the British kind of get a second wind here. Now, when the British finally show up here, especially along the East Coast, coming in, encroaching on the U.S. capital, a lot of slaves that live in the region end up either escaping or revolting. Okay, so this is kind of another repeat of what we saw in the American Revolution. Again, a lot of very similar themes here. The slaves end up either, again, going over to the British side because they've been promised their freedom, or they end up escaping altogether, or end up revolting against their former masters here. It's estimated that in Virginia and Maryland, over 3,000 slaves end up escaping. And in some cases, again, they do go off and join the British Army here. And the British actually even designate a specific military unit made up of all black soldiers, 400 of which are former slaves, and they refer to them as the Colonial Marines. And this is another instance where, again, the British tried to use the fears of the Southerners against them, okay? Because the one thing the Southerners continue to fear all throughout the 19th century here, leading up into the Civil War, of course, is that somehow the slaves that are, at a disadvantage under white slave owners are somehow going to become radicalized, are going to become armed, and are going to end up rising up and killing all the whites. Okay, and of course they have good reason to fear this because of everything that occurs. And so immediately what the British do is they put these black soldiers at the vanguard, and once they start marching them into slave-holding territory, all the slave owners suddenly freak out and run away because they realize their worst fears are coming upon them. So again, it's something that acts both as poetic justice here, in the eyes of the British anyway, and also as something that unfortunately is not done with complete altruism, because the British realize that at this point in time, a black soldier is considered to be collateral damage. Okay, this is something where if you put black soldiers at the vanguard, if they're successful or not, it's not going to diminish the British numbers. Okay, so again, it's a horrible reality to face here, but the British are not doing anybody any favors by doing this, really. On August 24th of 1814, the unthinkable happens. This is the first and only time this has ever happened, and that the British forces invade Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. Okay, and again, this is something that tends to get glossed over in the midst of all of this. Okay, people don't like to admit the fact that the U.S. was very, very close to defeat here. Okay. Dolly Madison, though, is credited here with actually running back inside the White House and then running into the Capitol building while they're actually burning, and she manages to save Washington's portrait, which you see here. This is the famous portrait of George Washington that still exists today. And she also saves the Declaration of Independence, the original. Okay, she rolls it up and runs out against everyone's wishes. Right, everybody is trying to prevent her from going back in. So the White House, the Library of Congress, and the Capitol building are all burned to the ground, okay, completely leveled here. And to add insult to injury, this occurs in August. The very next day, a tornado hits Washington, D.C. and scatters the debris even further. Okay, so this is, it seems like the entire universe is basically coming down against the United States here. It sounds like the wrath of God, almost. James Monroe, meanwhile, ends up stepping in and replacing the Secretary of War, who ends up resigning in disgrace. And at this point, James Monroe is serving two different offices at the same time. He's already Secretary of State, and now he's serving as Secretary of War as well. On September 13th, the British try to bombard Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, but they never are able to actually do a whole lot of damage. Okay, and this inspires Francis Scott Key, who is watching this happen, to write the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay? And so the Star-Spangled Banner becomes kind of the first real uniting, rallying cry and morale boost for the United States. And it comes in the middle of a war that, again, seems relatively unjustified. Okay, but again, this causes the U.S. to gain kind of a second wind. And now we actually have a song that can kind of back things up a little bit. And so this is why you hear the Star-Spangled Banner refer to the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. It's referring to the attack on Fort McHenry. On September 11th of 1814, we get the Battle of Lake Champlain, in which the British fleet is either destroyed and or captured. Okay, so this effectively ends the British ability to wage war in the Northern Campaign. Okay, so they end up kind of shutting down their operations in the Great Lakes region and focusing a little bit more on kind of the middle and southern regions now. Andrew Jackson ends up seizing Pensacola, Florida in November, okay, and this prevents the British from landing all the way far south. So now we've kind of begun to sandwich them in a little bit more. And Congress finally makes the decision to rebuild Washington, D.C. Okay, this seems like it was almost a failed experiment for when the British came in and destroyed this, because it seems like, if they're capable of doing this, what else are they capable of doing? In the aftermath of all of this, we get the arrival of John Quincy Adams, who is the son of former President John Adams. Okay, and John Quincy Adams here acts as a U.S. diplomat, going along with Henry Clay to Ghent, which is near Brussels, in kind of north of France, along the border with Germany and so forth. And they end up treating with the British here to decide what's going to happen in the aftermath of this conflict, because now the British have pretty soundly been defeated here. Okay. British agree that they're going to end the war just because of the sheer cost of it, right? It's turning into a money pit for them, okay? And also, they're getting pressured from their own merchants to resume commerce with the United States, okay? It's not just the U.S. that want to do business with the British really want to do business with us as well. And so the Treaty of Ghent is signed on December 24th of 1814. Okay? Both sides agree to end the war, return prisoners, and restore all original boundaries. Okay, so this seems, again, to be an almost self-defeating principle with this war. Nothing is gained, a lot is lost, and a few precedents are set. But again, there's not really any kind of advantageous outcome here. The British returned all captured territories and agreed that they are going to stop native attacks once and for all. All the southern territories are taken from the British, the Spanish, and the natives. Okay, so the U.S. does gain a little bit of this. And the Battle of New Orleans is kind of the last major stand of this. And this actually ends up occurring after the Treaty of Ghent is signed. And it's a statement of just how slowly news ends up traveling from one side of the world to the next. Okay? It takes 6 full weeks for news of the treaty to actually reach America. And by that point in time, Andrew Jackson has arrived in New Orleans and has declared martial law. The British fleet attempts to land on December 12th and take control of the Mississippi River, and the Americans end up fighting them off. Okay, Jackson puts up fortifications, prevents them from landing, and actually ends up killing 2,100 redcoats, along with 2 generals and 80 other officers in the midst of all this. And in the midst of this, too, only 13 Americans are killed. Okay, so again, under Jackson's forces, very few Americans are killed, but there's a very bloody and violent response on the part of the Americans here. Okay, so it seems like it just cements America's supremacy at the end of all this. Now we come to the last gasp of the Federalist Party, something called the Hartford Convention. And this happens, again, in the midst of the war having already come to an end, but the news not having reached the United States yet. On December 15th of 1814, the Federalists all get together in New England at Hartford, Connecticut, to try to come up with some kind of subversive action to end the war and reassert their dominance in U.S. politics. Okay. They propose that there are going to be 7 new constitutional amendments to limit the influence of the Republican Party. For one, they're going to abolish counting slaves to determine a state's representation in Congress. Okay, this is something that, again, has been used as a loophole by the Republicans through the 3/5 compromise. Okay, remember the 3/5 compromise states that a slave is not worth a full human being, but only 3/5 of a human being. And this has allowed the southern states to have a much larger representation in the House of Representatives. Okay, they're able to send more representatives just because of this. But again, it's a loophole because the slaves themselves are not considered human beings or citizens. They're considered as property. Federalists also want to require a 2/3 majority vote to declare war or admit any new states. So they want this to be a little bit more democratic, ironically. They want to prohibit trade embargoes lasting more than 60 days. Again, this kind of goes along with their interest to get rid of this trade embargo that's been going on with Great Britain. They want to completely exclude immigrants from holding federal office at all. Okay, and this is kind of a strange one. It seems like it doesn't really come into fruition with the rest of this. They want to limit the president to only 1 term, and this is kind of funny because their only president so far, John Adams, has only served 1 term. Okay. They want to fully bar any successive presidents from the same state. So again, from Virginia in particular, they don't want any more Virginian presidents. And they discuss the possibility of partial secession, taking New England and making it a completely separate country. So ironically, the North was the first one to come up with the idea of seceding from the Union before the South ever did. And when the news of the victory in New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent arrives, suddenly the Federalists have egg all over their face because it seems like they have had kind of this vote of no confidence in the United States to get the job done. And so now everyone starts to accuse them of cowardice, and it causes them to lose a lot of credibility in politics after that. Okay? And of course, they never recover from the shame. They end up completely fading out of existence not too long thereafter and are completely replaced by another political party. And now all of a sudden, James Madison has gone from being the target of impeachment, potentially, for getting us involved in a war that's too expensive to win, to being hailed as a national hero. Now, the outcome of the War of 1812, again, seems to be a little bit of a contradiction. Okay? There is no clear military victor here. Okay? Technically, it's a draw. Great Britain didn't win, and the United States did not win. Okay? And there is no resolution of any of the issues that happened before the war. Again, a few minor victories here and there, a little bit of territory gained in the South, right? A promise, very vague, that the Native American tax are going to stop, and that the British Navy is not going to impress any more sailors into service. 7,000 Americans are either killed or wounded, though, in all this. Okay, so a lot of lives lost for very little gain. And despite the fact that the officers and the powers that be heavily mismanaged the strategy and the effectiveness of the U.S. military here, the actions of the U.S. military end up inspiring patriotism. And again, it ends up uniting the country in the way that that the Republican Party expected it to. Okay, so it seemed like a very long shot that this would work, but somehow it did. British blockades end up leading to a major cotton cloth shortage in the United States, and this ends up having the longest term effect on everything. Okay, because after this, more than 160 cotton mills are actually constructed by the time the war ends. And this leads to the rise of the cotton industry in the United States. Okay? So now that the United States has not relied on Great Britain for its cotton supply, it begins planting its own cotton. And all of a sudden, cotton explodes as this major industry in the South, leads to the deepening of slavery, of oppression, and causes us to hurtle headlong into what eventually turns into the Civil War. When it comes to the Federalists and the Republicans and their ideologies, they almost go into a complete reversal of attitudes here. Okay, the British invasion of Washington, D.C., for example, says that convinces James Madison that a stronger military is needed. Okay, so we end up beefing up our military a little bit more. And the Second Bank of the United States is established here, okay, because all of a sudden we realize that we need some kind of financial stability in order for the economy to thrive. There's greater calls for more tariffs to try to protect American industry. And suddenly Madison is embracing nationalism, okay, and a broader constitutional interpretation here. And the Federalists start to embrace states' rights and a stricter constitutional interpretation. Okay, so again, their attitudes are beginning to reverse a bit. And when it comes to native tribes in the East, there's an irreversible amount of damage that's done. Okay, and eventually, once Andrew Jackson becomes president in the next decade or so, we start to see native tribes in the East dwindle down to virtually nothing. And of course, this also accelerates Western migration. Okay, a lot of war veterans are actually given large parcels of land out west between the Illinois and Mississippi rivers, okay, 160 acres apiece. And the population of the United States grows exponentially virtually overnight, from 300,000 people to 2 million between 1800 and 1820. Okay, so the United States is now beginning its major growth stage. And throughout the rest of the 19th century, as we'll see here, this is when the United States finally becomes a transcontinental nation. Okay, we end up stretching from the Atlantic coast all the way across and finally hitting the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so from this point forward, we'll begin discussing all that. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.